Hi, everyone. I'm Robin Fossil with IDC, CIO Executive Council. Thank you for joining us for the May 11th edition of the Power Hour. Today's session is Pervasive IT Planning, Intelligence, Governance, and Cultural Agility. This is an interactive session, and we have a lot of time for your questions. We encourage you to join in the conversation by using the raise hand feature, or you can add your comments to the chat. We'll do our best to work those into the conversation. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's session, Tim Scannell, Vice President of Strategic Content for IDC's CIO Executive Council. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, thank you, Robin, and welcome everyone to this IDC CIO Executive Council webcast discussion on IT planning, governance, and cultural agility. This sounds like a title of a textbook or a technical manual. Don't be fooled. It is more of a roadmap with multiple byways and avenues, some more efficient than others, that includes a fair number of detours and annoying cul-de-sacs. What's worse is that the speed limits on these digital transformation highways and byways have tripled, and the urgency to reach milestone destinations is often entirely off the scale. Despite uncertainties, many IT organizations have accelerated their digital transformation plans over the past few years to keep pace with rapid changes in the workforce, a significant rise in e-commerce activities, and the shift to a virtual engagement world. Cracks and inefficiency quickly began to show in existing technology infrastructures and digital apps over the past few years, requiring quick fixes and workarounds to keep things plugging along. However, these shortcuts may be unsuitable for the long term, notes McKinsey in a 2020 global study. As a result, most every company is taking a hard look at existing IT architectures and making an effort to eliminate or upgrade legacy systems, reduce technical debt, and enhance the flexibility and scalability of IT infrastructures to increase resiliency and keep pace with digital-first mandates and objectives. All of this puts new pressures on IT leaders and the IT organization, especially as the business gets more involved in deciding which technology solutions make the most sense in terms of customer engagement, bottom line revenue, and business continuity. As IDC points out in a 2022 Planscape research report, modern IT is pervasive and permeates every aspect of business and the personal and professional lives of leaders, workers, and customers. The report, that focuses specifically on pervasive IT governance, also notes that business stakeholders have taken on larger roles in adopting and using digital technologies. As a result, CIOs may have diminished direct control over enterprise IT and legitimized shadow IT projects. At the same time, however, these IT leaders are still largely responsible and accountable for the impact technology has on the entire business. All in all, an interesting time to be in the driver's seat on this digital roadway. In this evolving digital landscape, IT leaders must be adept at orchestrating highly distributed IT activities to maintain some semblance of control and authority, or at least keep track of technology initiatives that are tucked within the lines of business segments. The key to this is new IT governance models and operational standards that can be applied to collaborative work environments and are designed for partnerships instead of maintaining departmental partitions. This is what we're going to talk about today in this session. Joining me in the discussion are Sarah Schmidt, Senior Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at US Foods, and Daniel Saroff, Group Vice President of Consulting and Research at IDC and a Senior Practitioner in the end user consulting practice. Of course, I'd like to have everyone in attendance today join in on the conversation. So please ask questions and share your insights as well as we explore the topic of pervasive IT planning. Thanks very much. What I'll do is I'll start with my first question just to get the conversation started. So this is both to you, Daniel, and for Sarah. Digital transformation as a distinct effort has been in existence since around 2011, when the term made its debut and became an honorary buzz phrase in computer systems and solutions. But it can also be traced back to the development of the microchip and integrated circuits in the 1950s. So it's not a new thing. It's just something that's really top of mind right now. Today, the technology and people strategies, as well as the compliance concerns involving digital transformation, are a lot more complicated. How extensively has the definition and the nature of IT governance changed over the past few years? And are we at the very early stages of this evolution? Also, is this a perpetual roadway, or is there a light at the end of the DX tunnel? Daniel, I'll pick on you first.
Okay, well, thank you, Tim. That's quite a lot to unpack. I mean, I think the short answer to it, nobody's surprised, is 10 years is a short period of time. And yeah, what we look at in IDC itself looks at digital transformation. We talk about there are really 3 stages of it. And I think what we've seen in our research is most companies are in really the stage 2 area of digital transformation, which is where they're really starting to align the business and the IT organizations more. They're starting to digitize a fair amount of their organization, but they're still, one could say, typically more like a 60-40% organization. There are exceptions to that as well. And it's not just a technology change, but it's also a cultural focus change, because it involves, similarly to Agile, similarly to the cloud, significantly greater involvement and engagement between IT organizations and the business, and it also requires a change in the CIO role. So for example, we're seeing a number of CIOs who are starting to look at the services they're providing internally and whether they could actually be products that align with the business and could be sold to external companies or external customers. Sarah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Daniel, great start. I think we all desire to be in that continual evolution from a digital transformation space, where we are close in partnership with your IT teams and your business teams, and you see minimal separation. We're all on the same page, and we continue to evolve, and we continue to be agile and work through that. And so transformation becomes this, ideally no longer this thing that happens at one point and then you stop. It's this continual evolution. So maybe early path, like you were saying, Tim, are we there, or is this perpetual? I feel like we want to be at the perpetual stage. I think we're very early days still.
Yeah, and that's the feeling. Daniel mentioned we're stage 2, and I think that maybe a pre-pandemic of this whole thing that was okay, but it seems like we've gone from stage 2 to stage 7 now. It's an entirely different ballgame. It's not only collaborating with the business. We have business and line of business people doing projects that IT may not be aware of, and the poor CIO or IT leader or the information officer is saying, what is going on here? I got to have some semblance of control. So do you think that some things have leapfrogged, Daniel, or is things progressing as normal?
Well, I'm going to push a bit back on a bit of a thesis, because what you're describing is if the businesses are doing technology which IT isn't aware of, then that's really shadow IT. That's not digital transformation. Digital transformation is really taking traditionally physical processes and turning them into digital ones. That could either be the customers, that could be internally, et cetera. So if you have the business organizations driving their own technology stack, which is separate potentially from the internal IT stack, then what you're really saying is all you're doing is you're distributing technology out to the businesses, and you're creating what happened in the early parts of the odds. You're creating either shadow, or it's not shadow because it's officially approved IT organization, which means then you're losing the synergies. You're also losing the ability to get consistent data across an organization, consistent processes, things like that will give you 360 view of the customer. And I'd argue that if you're doing that, if you're having the businesses driving isolated silos of technology, it's sort of the analogous difference is the difference between multi-channel marketing and omni-channel marketing. Multi-channel marketing is I'm marketing to a customer through multiple different channels, in stores, on the phone, on the web. Omni-channel is I'm marketing across all these channels, and I have visibility across all these channels. That's digital transformation. Otherwise, what we're doing is I don't know, multi-channel digitization, or very old speak from an operations perspective, what we used to call sub-optimization, where you're optimizing each part at the deficit of the whole. Sarah?
Yeah, and you've torn the Band-Aid off the sword there. I wasn't gonna bring up shadow IT till we got used to the tone and the cadence here, but we're gonna hit that now. And you're absolutely right. On the outset, looking from the outside in, it does seem to be shadow IT. But if you look at what's happening with business being a part of the decision process in terms of reprioritizing projects, what IT should do to drive business or drive customer experience, there's the potential. It's not shadow IT anymore in some respect, and there's a potential for a lot of shadow IT projects to slip in there under the radar. Sarah, now I'll open up to your thoughts.
Yeah, Tim, Daniel, we are seeing more and more what was traditionally shadow IT, and it's actively being marketed to our business partners to say, from vendors saying, use us, we're faster, we're cheaper than your own IT team. And so how do we as IT leaders show up for that? Because we know that may give a really quick win, but it's not scalable. It's not omni-channel, like you were saying, Daniel, and it lacks governance, which Tim, you've hit on kind of briefly already. It lacks the overarching oversight that we are going to need to be successful long term. And so how do we manage that, I think is a great question. How do we show up as IT partners to be the best partner, the best participant, the best collaborator, to be fast and cheap like our business partners want? That's what I think we're trying to see, how we can transform as an IT organization to show up in a way that our business partners need us to be, which is that omni-channel view instead of that one-off.
Yeah, and I like the term omni-channel because it reminds me of omnipotent, which means all powerful, which means you come together, you're going to have more strength and power. Daniel, your views on that in terms of omni versus omni-channel versus multi-channel. I know you mentioned that before, but is there a danger of more shadow IT and less control for the IT leader going forward?
Well, I mean, I think the short answer is potentially, but let me actually go back to something Sarah said, because I think Sarah said something which was really insightful, which is some sort of oversight. And by the way, an oversight often means slowing things down, which is not necessarily the case. So I just want to clarify that it's not putting roadblocks. And I think that's where I'm going to mention two words which cause most people to cringe. That's where enterprise architecture really comes in, which is if you're doing a digitization effort. And in some ways, if you're doing digitization properly, and boy, is that a tough word to say, you're almost publishing a service catalog for your businesses to use and take up and to really help enable their business. And they're bringing feedback in so you could help create the appropriate service catalog. But the way to do it and to sort of avoid some of the problems we're talking about being, getting to the omni-channel state, the holistic view, is by putting in place a common framework, which is, as you said, your words, Sarah, and I agree, through enterprise architecture, where you get the businesses involved in helping define the architecture, refresh the architecture, involve the architecture, looking at different technologies, looking at different media and delivery of those technologies, et cetera. And that's, once you have that in place, or you have that center of excellence, you could say, in place to do that, then the ability for the businesses to sort of pick and choose from a relatively complete responsive suite that addresses their needs works, while also ensuring the organization as a whole gets the data they need, the customer views, the client views, the whole thing. So that was not really answering your question, Tim, but it was responding to what I thought was Sarah's really good insight.
No, I'm glad you built upon that. And that brings up the next question I have of, can existing standards and procedures be applied to a business where now, where a relationship rather, where now the IT and the business are co-conspirators or co-owners? Can we adapt the existing rules, or do we have to wait and involve newer rules and newer mandates going forward?
I'll start with that. We can adapt what we have in place right now, knowing that it's not going to be perfect right now, and we're going to have to adapt again in 6 months to a year. We're going to have to continue to be in that same room with our business partners while it happens. And I think that's key. Is this is an evolution, and it's unlikely to end. We're unlikely to finish. And so the putting oversight, putting governance, using what we have now is a solid starting block. We've worked years to get to that point, so let's not throw it away. Let's just be open to modifying and adjusting to meet the needs, to showing up the way that our business partners need us to.
So you said we have to modify and update every 6 months, every year. It sounds like we're getting, it's a vaccination syndrome. We have to keep things steady like that. Is that a typical routine, even if you take away the COVID in the past few years, or is that an accelerated version of what we had before?
I think we were regularly, annually reviewing standards and governance processes. I think we are increasing that maybe to twice a year, just to ensure that we have all the new changes, right? Things like like generative AI, there's lots of things that hit us that we need to respond to right away, and we can't wait for a year-long cycle to get back to those. So I feel we're accelerating, but not a ton. We should have been doing this relatively regularly in the past.
Well, if we had a crystal ball, what about you, Daniel? Have we accelerated? Are we heading into eras of increased acceleration?
Let me use an analogy. And analogies are sometimes bad. So folks are welcome to tell me if this is a bad analogy or not. This is not dissimilar in a way from when we moved from waterfall to agile development. And by the way, some folks are still waterfall, and almost nobody's 100% agile. But even when we moved from waterfall to agile, there were still some of the practices that we kept in place. And then we moved to agile. We found there were lots of significant advantages, but then we suddenly found, for example, visibility and transparency into projects and costs started to go away. And then there were problems around control of quality. And so then some of the more traditional practices, things like function point analysis to assess productivity, code analysis tools, floated back in from the waterfall process into agile to create an actually better process overall. So to support what Sarah says, yeah, you could take your existing processes, and then what's going to happen is we're come to a tipping point where we're finding that we've evolved to a level where it all starts to break, and believe it or not, it's going to be back to the future for part of it and going in. And it's a continually recursive cycle. I mean, to even be more analogous and go more old school, what is cloud computing but mainframe computing renamed? So these things come around. Yes, it's going to accelerate, but we're going to see the same things flowing back and forth because frankly, that's what we've seen for generations of technology and development as a whole. The key to change, I think, is the cultural change.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the harder part. That's the part between the technology organization and the business organization. We saw a bit of this in the early aughts when knowledge management came into fad, where suddenly you saw CIOs, for example, getting elevated up because of the value of knowledge management. And then that didn't pan out, and they sort of returned more to the back office. So I guess that's I don't know if it's a cynical or a realistic view that I do think these things will accelerate. I do think we'll see more of it, but we're also, it's like a helix. With a helix, you keep passing the same point over and over again as you go higher up the chain. And that's how I view this is going to be. We're going to repeat things we've done in the past, even as we evolve it.
And speaking of moving forward, and you mentioned waterfall and agile, and that some companies are still have at least their toes in waterfall. Are those companies that are still doing some waterfall to some extent, do they have an edge in terms of making changes because they're not entirely invested in agile, and it might be more difficult to inject that agile mindset into business?
I think it's a tool and it's what they're comfortable with or they're not comfortable with, and that's a hard one.
Yeah, that remains to be seen too. We'll just have to wait and have another webcast at another time and tackle that issue. On the topic of culture, and this one's
just 1 second. I do see that Charisse has her hand up with a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Go ahead, Charisse, if you come on camera.
I'm sick, and
I'm sorry to hear that.
I have to keep my camera off.
All right. Go ahead, Charisse.
But I do think, because this is very timely, because as I've spoke with you before, we are hiring for 2 new DCIOs, and one is for IT planning, strategy, and governance. And for those of you I work for the courts. I work for Superior Court of Arizona. And so we've come from the courts have they've transitioned from being like a very paper-based system and very traditional desktop 4 walls. And COVID, again, made them it made them hyper aware of cloud technologies and all that's possible with that. And so we have some fairly tech savvy judges with influence. And so, and they're the biggest, I would say shadow IT, or at least in ideas, they are definitely the most, do that the most often. But what we're doing is we had a strategy meeting, and one of the things that became very apparent to me was we needed a governance process, because first of all, I think that sometimes they don't know what IT does. So they only see what's in front of them. And then they're like, well, what are you doing that you can't help me do what I want to do? And so we're working on making that more transparent, even though they may not completely understand what or the why, but it's, I mean, IT is other things other than just UI, right? And so that's part of the conversation. And then where it comes to Agile, I mean, I do think that that is a really good opportunity to make the business part of the process, because they're there as the stakeholder, they're there doing working on the user story. So they feel like they're part of the process. And then I think that helps them to become more invested in maintaining a tight relationship with IT, because they get to be part of that process, and they get to see their thoughts come to fruition. So for us, we have judges, and judges are elected officials. So in a lot of ways, they are entitled to do what they want. And one of the things that I do have to work with is like corralling them. And I don't want to inhibit them, and we don't want IT to seem like we're a roadblock or unnecessary bureaucracy. But at the same time, I have to make sure that what they're trying to do is cost efficient, it's supportable, and it's manageable, right? And it doesn't incur some costs that all of a sudden my budget has to absorb.
Yeah, and and your challenges sound a lot like those of healthcare, where doctors use mobile devices, they love their technologies, but when it comes time for hospitals to buy the back end infrastructure and stuff like that to support it, it doesn't often happen. And in your case, it's the judges who love the technology and expect things to be delivered that may not necessarily be in time, either technologically or from a governance standpoint. Sarah, what about your viewpoint on that? Is there a lot of training involved for the business side? They're tech savvy, but sometimes you can be too tech savvy with the wrong perceptions.
Yeah, you can. I was going to comment on something Shri said that's really interesting and puts it in perspective for me as a technologist. Technology vendors, so folks that don't work in your organization, have sales teams. They're really good at the sales side of it. Your IT team does not have a sales team, and they do not show up in the same way to your business partners as an outside vendor does. And so we are trying to do exactly what you talked about, Tim and Daniel, about having a catalog of things we're really good at, and having a history of being good at those things too, because I think that's important. But we often fall short in that convincing of our business partners why we're the right person for them to do this work with, because we don't do a great job of exactly what you were just saying, Sharice, of here's all the other stuff that comes with it that we're going to do for you as your IT partner, that you're not going to get from this outside vendor. Here's all the background, this back end work, the mainframe behind it, and all of this stuff that you don't see. That's just as important as this GUI, nice, pretty interface you see on the outside.
Daniel, I think you mentioned the need for universal, or we all agree there's a need for a universal governance structure that's understandable by both IT and business, sort of the rules of the road.
Absolutely.
But is it possible to effectively track and manage all the technology initiatives, that the kinetic energy there of things that just might be happening soon, especially those not under IT's control, and add to that the fact that there are a lot of rules and regulations on the business side, but as I'm sure that Sarah will admit, just telling trying to ingrain in people the importance of cybersecurity safeguards and educate them, it's over and over and over again from the business side. What are your views on that? Is a universal governance structure possible, or can be bifurcated in some way?
Darn good question. I'm going to do a quick sidebar because I want to say, Sharice, I was the CIO for the Massachusetts Public Defender Agency for 7 years. So I worked with the courts all the time. And I would be happy to have a conversation with you later about how we worked with the courts in Massachusetts, if that would be helpful to you.
Oh, wow. It's technology kismet. I love it.
Yeah, no, I still love the courts to this day, or I love the legal. No. Anyway, I don't believe in monolithic big bang structures. I think they tend to become atrophied and inefficient. I think the key thing is to focus on one, as we talked about, what are the services that can be provided? 2, listening carefully to the business about what services they need. 3, sometimes figuring out how to do what I call saying no with a yes, which is if the business is coming to you with a request, which is a reasonable request, and for whatever reason, technical standards, this, that, or the other thing, you can't do it. Saying no is the best way to drive them to create shadow IT or get an outside vendor. Saying no with a yes, which is they give you you listen to what their need and the concern is, and then you look at how you could address it, even if you're not addressing it directly the way they are. That's the best mechanism. And then a process to really identify what are the key initiatives that really need to be cross-divisional or organizational wide, because you can be fine with organizations having a different suite of technologies with the caveat that they may be very locally structured. But what you want to be careful about is when these things get put together and then you try to integrate them in a enterprise fashion, you get what's called fragility. And it means that you get data gaps, you get data breaks, you get system breaks, et cetera. And so that's when you want to look at whether what's being proposed and what's being used in a division is something that is really truly unique to the division, and defining what those criteria are versus what need to be across, and then what need to be tracked at a level that, for example, you'd say executive management. So CIO, CEO, CFO, division heads need to know, and what really doesn't, because there's a limited bandwidth people are going to have to these oversight groups, these reports. And so you have to practice really the 20-80 rule here. What 20% do they really need to know, and what 80% doesn't add value to the communicating the mission and the purpose of IT, and drives too much drag or causes people to be meeting to death. So that, I guess, would be a long answer to your relatively short question, Tim.
Relatively. Sarah, I think one of the challenges that every IT leader faces today, Daniel gave the terms cross-divisional utility, and I think that's very important. You don't want to develop individual solutions for every department or every group within departments. That'd drive you insane, and it's not cost effective. However, that's the challenge now. If you can't focus things, how do you make these things more universal across different departments? And I've talked to people in state government, and that's even in education. Sometimes it's not possible. I mean, we have somebody in higher ed, a CIO, who wanted to centralize all of, I think it was 14 different IT departments, and he couldn't. He did everything but the hospital and the legal schools. He just couldn't do those things. So there are roadblocks like that. How do you tackle that, and what kind of challenges do you see going forward?
Are areas where we can be consistent, and there's areas where we're going to have to be different, right? And I think that example that you just shared between a hospital and a legal school are night and day difference. But when you see those opportunities for consistency, and I look at, especially in my space in security, like training on cybersecurity is universal. Everyone needs to do it, and it can look relatively similar. Sure, we cater things here and there for the audience, but there's some baseline that everyone's going to have. And so I think it's important that we identify what can be consistent and what needs to be separate. Because if we do each different line of business, each different piece entirely different, we'll drive ourselves crazy, right? We won't be able to wrap our arms around that. And so finding the things, again, thinking in my space, particularly about cybersecurity, third-party risk management, that's a consistent process across every one of my business partners. Security awareness and training can be consistent. There are certain spaces, absolutely draw the line, and then spaces where we have to show up different depending on the value stream.
And David, what are your views? I know, years ago there was efforts to, write once and use it a lot of times. Writing that's kind of difficult. But everything is coming into more centralization, I think, rather than distributed, and you want to limit the amount of time put on programming staff and teams like that. Is there an equitable balance between things you can do multi-divisionally versus individually?
Yes, and I think this comes back to what Sarah's talked about before standards. So let me give you an example with a client. So last year I worked with a $100 billion logistics company, and they had divisions around air freight, ground transport, tracking, et cetera, et cetera. Each of those divisions had enterprise architecture teams. Those enterprise architecture teams then had representatives on a central enterprise architecture team. So what that ensured was that the various groups, and as you could imagine, air transport is very different from ground transport. For example, air transport, you have to deal with, in bills of international lading, import-export controls. Ground transportation, it's, routing through towns and cities, let's say just in America, so you don't have to deal with those issues. So what they did was they recognized, one, that they needed a common set of standards so they could have a common set of technologies so they could once again get to the omni view. But two, they also recognized they had very distinct needs, just exactly what Sarah said with her folks. So what they did was they developed their standards, they flowed them up, they got approval, and then they flowed them back down. And so what that did was it gave them the autonomy to be able to do what they necessarily needed based on common standards, practices, patterns. But they were able to tailor it to their needs and be responsive and flexible. Yes, there's a little overhead because you had to go through that process to take it up to and then bring it back down, but it ultimately gave them the flexibility. And over time, it became quite natural. When you start it, it's hard because you're bringing this all together. There's a lot of work in the first 6 months, but after that, it actually becomes like any change control process because it's relatively small. You know the process, you move it forward. And that gave them the opportunity of what you might say being central, but allowing distributed responsibility and authority. Because what you want to avoid is distributed responsibility with centralized authority. Because if you have that, that means the people at the outside are going to be frustrated because they're responsible for delivering to the business, but they don't actually have the authority to do it. So that's how both of those were distributed while maintaining a coherent structure.
Robin, I think we have a question from Matt, if you want to read that.
We do, yes. Matt asks, how do you find that solving the most complicated scenario drives success for the majority?
I chuckled when I read that, so I'll start.
Yeah.
Right, you want that to be never. Right? You don't want to solve for the 5%, but that's often the squeakiest wheel as well. That's often the one that's yelling the loudest. And so what I have done is just what Daniel said, find the standards, right? Here's our playbook of things we do off the bat. I'm not going to change that to support this incredibly complicated scenario. I'm also going to understand the risk of leaving that thing on its own and not solving for it. I'm not letting it drive success for the majority. If that thing is so important, then sure, it's gonna pivot the way I operate. Or in my world, so risky that I'm making an informed decision about it. But I also have a tendency to say, if that thing is so small, and I'm going to do so much work to solve for just that one thing, like, do I really need to do that? Or can I go back to the 80-20 rule? Which is not a great answer, Matt. You want like how often? I don't have only 2% of the time you should do that. I don't have a pinpoint answer on that. But I would caution anyone who's trying to solve for the most complicated, the most difficult thing, and spend all your time and dollars when maybe a much shorter, easier solution that fit the majority would be a better road forward.
Maybe Daniel has a fraction for that.
Oh, well, I have a fraction for, I could tell you anything you want. It's just not going to be true. But actually, Matt, if you're willing to speak, let me ask you what caused you to ask this question, because there's an underlying question behind the question, which I think could be really interesting. And then Sarah and I might be able to answer it better. But sure. I hear a real problem here. And so it'd be great if you wouldn't mind, if you're comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. Consider me intrigued. So when you said that you weren't tackling legal and the health business, mostly due to complexity. So I guess I'm finding the reverse strategy to be effective, which is, so more along the lines of, needing to secure things. How do you secure holistically against all levels of data and information, health, legal, otherwise? Others shouldn't necessarily be a lesser than on the 80-20. And so, So I think it's more, how do you find solutions that work more broadly for your sets of business? I get that there's a 5% corner case. Don't go solve that. I agree that you can't dump that time and money in there. And that is where those businesses do have to have some differentiation. But against an operational platform at the core, I think you can find significant value and efficiency, and really support those businesses and empower them in ways that they probably couldn't empower themselves. Now, political challenges may preclude you from getting over that hill, or that may become a hill that you don't want to die on. Different problem.
I think you raise a good point, and let me give you an example. Once again, I like to make things real. So in my previous job, we rolled out an agency-wide case management system. So case management system is a system used to manage legal cases. As a public defenders, we had a criminal division, crimes. We had a children and family law division, which was around custody of children, foster parents, things like that. We had a mental health litigation division, which was around forced institutionalization, things of that general nature. And then we had a youth advocacy division, which was to keep kids from the school to prison pipeline, i.e. getting kicked out of school, which led to them being imprisoned. I mentioned that because you would say, and I would agree, these are all very different divisions. They do very different things. So when we rolled out a case management system, what we did was we designed a case management system, and this gets to the point of commonality, which would capture the common aspects also from our need to be able to report to the state, and also to assess the quality of our attorneys, and also to be assessed whether there might be racial or ethnic biases in various courts. We needed to do all that. So we created something that would actually do that by identifying what the commonalities were, and then basically giving them portlets, you could call it, which they would help define around their specific needs and data. And then there were some things we just couldn't do as part of the system. But so that's how we sliced it. We looked at what's the business need externally, what's the business need internally, what are the differences, what are the commonalities, how can we address the differences as best as possible, while still ensuring that as an organization, we could satisfy our legal, constitutional, client-based requirements. So hopefully that analogy, that story helped.
We have the same,
Go ahead.
that's essentially the same. I mean, we have our own case management system. And when we rebuilt it, the architecture, we rebuilt it so for the common functions, calendaring, a number of functions that are common to each department.
Mm-hmm.
And we reused that. And then, as you said, we had to account for the nuances, but the platform is as common as it can be. And then we just make those adjustments.
Exactly. The one thing I didn't mention was, which I'm sure you did as well, is we had initially 4 different systems, case management systems. We had a huge consolidation and normalization and rationalization effort. And I'm mentioning this because this gets back to can you do complex solutions that match everybody's needs? And the short answer is yes, if you do it properly. Did we do it properly? Knock on wood, hopefully we did.
Let's turn the conversation to culture, a little bit of culture and innovation. Sarah, in an earlier conversation this week, you talked about creating a digital playground where people in IT and business can safely innovate and try different things with a minimum of risk, hopefully. Everyone knows, however, that actual playgrounds can be a really dangerous place. But I wonder if you could provide some details on how that concept can be applied, or maybe you're applying that in sustaining a pervasive IT environment while maintaining an innovative culture.
Yeah, I think the goal there, and we hit on it early in the conversation on shadow IT, is if I don't give a place for my team members and my business colleagues to be innovative and be creative and try new things, they're going to do it on their own anyway. And then it's just going to be entirely outside of something that I have my arms and eyes on. And so building this digital playground, when we think about the use of cloud computing and cloud technologies, that was the beginning point, right? Is to build up, scale down. We have all this flexibility. And if we take that away, we're losing some of the benefits of some of the great technology that's been built over the past couple of decades. And we also lose the creativity of our team members if we force them into boxes. So I want to build this place that I've got all my guardrails around. I've got all my eyes on. I'm watching really carefully because I know it looks different than my standard tech stack. It's going to operate a little differently, and I'm going to put some controls on it to prevent people from doing things that I know are really dangerous. But still allow them to be creative and to be innovative, because I know if I don't give them that opportunity, they'll go find it someplace else. And yeah, you can get hurt in the playground, but hopefully it's a soft landing, right? Hopefully it's sand or something soft, rubber chips at the bottom that it's not going to be too detrimental. And they're not using production data. They're not doing all of these things that could be really dangerous if they operate.
It's pretty much offline, but in being offline and they, initially they realize it's a contained, safe environment. You have the barriers and the fences and the understanding of how far you can go. But, getting back to teaching people about the importance of security, all of a sudden you get this false sense of nothing's going to go wrong. And then you start to bleed out beyond that. How carefully can you keep a watch on what's happening in the playground while still managing everything else that's happening in terms of collaborative IT solutions?
And that's where culture comes into play, I think, Tim, in that having an informed workforce, not just my IT partners, but my entire business, having a security-minded organization that knows the difference between playground and real life, that knows that there are different rules. There's different requirements, because if there's not that just basic awareness, then I lose that game. Like you were just mentioning, Tim, I can't do all of it, and so I do need culture to play a big role in how we allow people to be innovative here, but then force standards and force requirements over here. And as those lines begin to blur, is where we find ourselves getting in trouble. And if I have folks just lack of awareness, we'll see more issues.
And Daniel, obviously you're very focused on the agile space, and maintaining an agile mindset and building an agile culture is very important, not only in IT but the business as well, in order for everything to mesh very smoothly. Do you see any clashes between what has to happen in this collaborative world in terms of that agile structure? Does it have to be adapted? Does it have to become more security minded going forward because you're containerizing and watching things very carefully?
I don't think agile is in conflict with security.
Not necessarily security, but in terms of what's happening in building a pervasive IT environment.
Well, I think building a pervasive the biggest risk threat in any environment is complexity and tightly coupled systems. So if we're talking about a pervasive IT environment, which means we're having increasingly complex and increasingly tightly coupled systems, then it does increase risk. And we were recently talking with a major client, and we were talking to them about their disaster recovery strategy. And security is part of disaster recovery, or disaster recovery is part of security, depending on how you want to look at it. And part of what we really discussed with them was the idea that nowadays we don't have applications, we have systems of systems. And once upon a time, the nice thing about big monolithic applications were they were big monolithic applications, and they were really fairly simple to structure and control and manage and secure. If you have system of systems, you've really elevated the risk level severely from a technology standpoint, from a process standpoint, from an organizational standpoint, from a people standpoint. And also the impact on one small subsystem can have huge ramifications across the entire solution or service that's being provided. And organizations frequently don't understand those implications. And it's actually pretty complex to understand.
I see. We'll move on to another topic. I don't think any webcast today can be completed or will be completed unless you use the term chat GPT. In fact, I get 25 cents every time I mention that from the developers. So I'll mention it a lot today. No, I won't. So mapping a pervasive IT infrastructure, mapping out the whole thing, how it's going to lay the land, so to speak, is tough enough when the technologies and structures are somewhat stable. But now you have all these sorts of technology agitators like ChatGPT and other generative AI enablers. And there are no guardrails, really. Guardrails are developing, the rules of the road are developing for these agitators, but they're coming full force at the enterprise. I'm wondering, how do you make use of such forms? Because you really have to, because you listen to IDC, and everyone should be, and that you have to be involved in some way, shape, or form, even if it's a pilot or investigation, because it's going to move very quickly and be a very strong enabler. How do you make use of these forms of emerging tech without messing up the foundational digital transformation structure and this pervasive IT movement, Sarah?
Yeah, you do have, like, we would have to go along with this journey, right? It's and even if you say, I don't want ChatGPT in my environment, there's generative AI in your environment already. There are people doing AI work, your vendors are using AI, and you may not even know about it. So great thing to put in contracts is to be aware of these things. And so the broader question is, like, how do we be a part of this? How do we govern it? How do we see this moving forward, so that we can enable our business to use this successfully and securely? And because we want to win, right? We all want our organizations to win. And if this is the thing that's gonna make that happen, I don't have a great answer for the question, Tim, because I don't think it exists yet. We are still waiting to see what it looks like, what it means for different organizations. There are some easy things we can say, some easy guidance I've published about, don't put company secrets in ChatGPT, relatively simple requirement. But what I've been trying to do more thoughtfully is try to understand, one, what my business partners know about generative AI. What do they think it does for them? Where do they think they're going to use it? Where do we as a technology team going to support it? Because those are not necessarily the same things. So we're going to use it in IT, and how my business thinks they're going to use it are not always the same conversation. And so it's been really critical that we are having those discussions together, and that I'm hearing them from a security perspective, understanding what risks and threat that could bring to our organization in the years to come.
Yeah, and the trouble is, it's moving so quickly. As I said earlier, when we're trying to build enterprises, are trying to build resiliency and throw innovation quietly into the mix if they get the CFO's nod, and then you have this agitator in there. And I think I mentioned, I mentioned earlier in a conversation before we went live, there was someone last weekend who used ChatGPT to write a novel in 2 days that is now available on Kindle. It's not me, I'm not trying to sell something, but it just shows you how fast these things are moving. How do you keep pace with that? This is like a really dangerous agitator. Daniel.
Well, first of all, just to go back, and I'll do a little plug. I recently, last week, published a report on the risks of ChatGPT. So if you want to go onto our website and look at it, you may do so. And I think, to reiterate some of what Sarah said, there are really 4 key risks that we're seeing. Well, let me first of all state this. Generative AI is we're seeing as a same level sea change as a PC revolution in the 80s and the smartphone revolution in the 10s. And I think in the past, IT has really resisted these. I remember, for example, I worked in an organization in the early 80s. I came in and I had to sign a waiver with the IT department to be able to bring in a PC to use in my lab. So one is, look at that from historical recognition and really figure out how, once again, how do you say no with a yes? How do you actually give people the ability to use these tools, play with these tools in a fashion that are safe and secure? And part of what Sarah's talking about is setting out clear policies around it. Additionally, it's looking at, as you say, there's the PII, personally identifiable information, and also the proprietary information. What do you want to do about that? You can, and for example, Samsung also did this. They say you're not allowed to post this, but there are now resources. For example, Microsoft is now has now offering private tenants of ChatGPT. So you could put that information in. It doesn't go into the general ChatGPT pool, and you could still pull that information as well. IBM just announced something similar as well. A number of organizations are announcing that as well. But you have to establish clear policies on how it should be used and what the use means. So for example, ChatGPT is very poor for very descriptive, concise, particular language. So if I were in a law firm, I would say any legal document that you want created in ChatGPT has to be reviewed by an attorney before it can go out. You cannot use it for such purposes. ChatGPT is also very poor for maintaining things like brand voice. So if I want to use it to help create marketing content, that's fine. It needs to go to an editor or whomever to ensure brand voice. Similarly, I think we're all aware that these products hallucinate, or as I prefer the term, confabulation, which is they say something that appears to be truthful but isn't totally inaccurate. And there have been lawsuits. An Australian mayor is suing ChatGPT because they reported that he had been convicted for foreign bribery. Turns out he was the person who reported this crime being committed, and other people went to jail for it. A professor ChatGPT reported that a New York, Washington Post article said he had abused one of his students on a trip to Alaska. Well, there was no trip to Alaska, and there was actually no Washington Post article. Now, if a private company published this, regardless of how they got this information, you'd now be open to litigation. So this means fact checking, no different from how we used to, voice checking, checking legal language, etc. And how do you deal with it? I think you have to recognize that it's not if people are going to use it, they are going to use it. And therefore, if they are going to use it, just like PCs, people brought in their PCs, and God knows the number of security risks they create in IT organizations. And people brought in their iPhones and their Android phones, and those created significant risks, and that's where containerization came about. So the question is, as an organization, we have to recognize they're going to use it. So how do we give them the guidelines and the instructions to be able to use it safely and securely, and also bring the innovation to our organizations? Because it is very valuable technology, but we have to give people guidelines, because we can't say you can't use it, because they will. That's the pure and simple. So.
Yeah.
That's so much of what you said, Sarah, when we spoke previously. You talked about educate, 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 but I love the phrase that you used. You said, we're on an allow and educate journey versus a prevent journey. I thought that was really a great statement.
Yeah, that is a great statement. Yeah. And some homework for the audience. So someone will, after this offline, use ChatGPT and ask it, how do you build a successful pervasive IT business environment? And let's see what it comes up with. It'll probably name Daniel, but that's okay. He's no, I'm only kidding. Okay, we've talked to, we're going to be collaborating more with the business side. We're building this pervasive IT business structure. Will this benefit in a good way the IT talent crunch? Because as business is taking over some of the development, and a lot of the business on the business side are co-partners, is this going to ease the pressures on you, Sarah, to keep on looking for really experienced talent in your organization?
Will it ease the pressures? I hope so. It's in across IT. We see the introduction of things like low code, no code, and the ability to kind of pull some of that off. The deep tech needs for technology are shifting. We still need some hardcore technologists in our organization. We're not going to get away from that anytime soon. What we're seeing in a security space, though, is hiring for passion, hiring for continual learning. There are some of these skills that I can train and educate you on. But we are perhaps hiring, not looking for a degree in cyber, not looking for someone who's a deep, can like wear dark hoodies and can code a lot. We are seeing a shift to the type of people we look to hire, and maybe that's just out of necessity. But we've also had a lot of success out of bringing in different types of talent, different backgrounds, and different upbringings into the technology space. I'm finding there's room for everyone. There's room for all sorts of skills. Back to my comment previously, if we're not great at sales, IT teams are building IT marketing groups, right? Change champions and all of that type of thing. So we are bringing in new talent. It still doesn't take away the need, though, for some of these really hard to find skills.
Does it ease the strain though? Because, you mentioned you're looking for someone with passion. It's someone who more strategic knowledge rather than the bits and the bolts and stuff. That may be somebody in the business side. There's one of our members who recruited a lawyer from the legal department to work on his data analytics team because that person thought so logically and it's working out very well. Do you see a lot more of that happening?
I do in my team. I'm a fan of pulling folks over from the business. I mean, who better can serve our business partners than someone who's walked a day in their shoes, and knows the risks in and out. When I can pull them to be more of a strategy leader, more of a thought leader on my team, that's been really, really helpful for me.
And Daniel, you've mentioned, cloud technology, and certainly as more people move to the cloud, more companies move to the cloud, maybe the foundational operational stuff of IT is lifted a little bit, and they're looking for new people to come in who have negotiation skills, communication skills, in addition, knowledge of how to apply the technology rather than to build the technology. I'm wondering if you see this as well in the companies you talk to, as a barrier or something that's going to really accelerate pervasive IT? Does it fit very well into that groove?
I think it does, because the cloud, as you alluded to, Tim, really brings together the business and the technology side, and by its nature. Because if you treat the cloud like you treat it on-prem, which is IT being a gatekeeper, you might as well not be in the cloud. So implicitly, it requires business involvement, which then implicitly drives the whole culture change of pervasive IT through. So I think cloud is actually one of the drivers to really what we're seeing with pervasive IT and the effective engagement or the increased engagement between business and technology. And I think Sarah's right. You bring people in for aptitude, not necessarily skills. And if you get them in from the business, that's 100% gain.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, so this is the final question I'll ask to both of you. We've touched upon a lot of positive approaches to establishing and maintaining a pervasive IT environment and culture. Now I'd like to talk about perhaps some of the caveats. What are some of the strategies or things that maybe were okay to do in the past, but not really okay to do today, considering increased IT business collaboration, emerging technologies, and just general plans going forward? Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, we hit on this really briefly, the difference between waterfall and agile, and Daniel said it right. We're not all agile, and some of us still have a foot in the waterfall camp. What I think we can no longer do is take a list of requirements from our business partners, walk away from 9 months, and come back and say, here, I did it, because that's no longer going to be what they need. It's going to have shifted and changed. And so being two separate bodies, an IT team and a business partner who only talk once every year, doesn't work anymore. We have to be in the same room at the same time, and we have to be on the journey together.
All right, and Daniel, your 1 minute overview of the caveats.
Culture eats technology every time. And the hard part is, how do you do it without creating grotesque overhead, a top-down fiat structure? And I've seen very few organizations who can do this easily, successfully. It takes multiple iterations, sort of the rule of three. You may get it right on the third time, and you have to accept that.
Okay, on that note, we're just about at the top of the hour and out of time today. I'd like to thank Sarah Schmidt, Senior Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at US Foods, and Daniel Saroff, Group Vice President of Consulting and Research at IDC and a senior practitioner in the end user consulting practice, for all taking part in this discussion today and offering their thoughts. I'd also like to thank everyone who attended the session today and took time to add their perspectives or just to listen in. And with that, back to you, Robin.
Great, thank you, Tim. I'd like to thank our guests and everyone who attended today. The session recording will be made available via our member platform, usually within about 24 to 48 hours. I'd also like to invite you to join us for our next Power Hour webinar, which will be IT Sustainability, moving from politically correct to measurable business value, on July 13th. This concludes today's session. On behalf of IDC CIO Executive Council, thank you for joining us, and see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.